Irene, I'm just totally humbled and honored. I really, really wish that my parents were alive to hear this, because they probably would have been the only ones in the room to have believed it. But I'd like to first of all thank Irene, Alter, and Mike for their wonderful, tireless work and devotion, not only for this event, but for 2 others in the next 2 days. And I also want to thank Rosemary Sarah, the president, and Anne Shackett and Peter Machuza. And all of the wonderful people that have helped with the events. John, I think it was, who printed up the brochures so beautifully in the last minute. I'm really, really honored. Okay, so thank you. So all of us are very, very concerned today. This is a horrible moment in American history. Just last night on our news screens, we saw yet another American journalist, Stephen Satloff, decapitated by yet another member of the Islamic State. Last week or 2 weeks ago, it was James Foley. I know that all of us have grave, grave concerns about the direction of this country and what will be there for our children and our grandchildren. So I'd like to open up my talk by speaking about another time in the world. This was a beautiful, beautiful time for America. It was in March of 2005 when in Beirut, Lebanon, proud Christians finally felt free to walk down the streets. Why? This was during the Cedars Revolution, because they knew that in the White House sat George W. Bush, who cared about the rights of religious minorities around the globe. And after our invasions in Iraq and Afghanistan, he knew that he was going to follow up his concern with the military might to protect them. Contrast this to today, when the violent, brutal, and bloodthirsty Islamic State just decapitated 2 American citizens and has claimed large swaths of Iraq, which, as you know, we have paid dearly for in our American treasure, and even more dearly in the lives of so many American citizens. And they've gained an important strategic foothold in Syria, to which President Obama said last Thursday, "I have no strategy." Contrast this again to today, when the Iranian mullahs have been given a perpetual extension after a deadline, in which they were supposed to have come up with an agreement with the P5+1 nations in terms of their nuclear intentions. And when our military budget has been stripped down into pre-World War II levels, where Russia is strengthening its suffocating grip on Ukraine, where red Chinese airplanes were provoking an American surveillance plane over the South China Seas, and where Libyan rebels laid siege to yet another American compound just this past weekend. The political philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli is widely attributed to have said, "You keep your friends at a distance and your enemies close." But I think with President Obama, you keep your enemies close and you throw your friends completely under the bus. How did we come to this? Well, first of all, we can all remember that hot mic moment in March of 2012 when President Obama was speaking with then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev in Seoul, South Korea, in regards to the missile defense negotiations. And he was talking about the missile stations, and he said what he thought was off the mic, "Wait until after the elections in November when I'll have more flexibility." And we can also remember how President Obama had said to the world on August 20th, 2012, "We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to the other players on the ground, that a red line for us is if we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons being moved moved around or utilized, that would change my calculus. That would change my equation. And then, almost a year and 1 day later, we witnessed across our television screens the specter of 1,429 bodies flinching in pain and moaning. And then we heard Vice President and Biden and Secretary of State John Kerry's impassioned pleas to go to war against the Assad regime. Then President Obama put his finger to the wind, and he realized that he lacked people's will for any military intervention. And so he decided that he would then punt the ball to Congress. And when he realized that he wouldn't have the necessary votes in Congress for military action, he decided to let Russia and Iran take care of the disposal of Iran's nuclear weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, to me that is like asking two known pedophiles to babysit your children. And finally, during a press conference in Stockholm on September 4th, 2013, President Obama said, "I didn't set a red line, the world set a red line." I would like to submit that we have all witnessed in real time Barack Hussein Pinocchio Obama's nose growing longer by the minute. We all remember when one of the first things President Obama did is, upon assuming office in 2009 was to cancel our joint missile defense treaties between us, Poland, and the Czech Republic. When Lech Walesa, the hero of the Solidarity movement, who helped bring down the Iron Curtain, found himself sitting across the table from President Obama in Warsaw earlier this past summer, it was no wonder he looked at the president right in the eye and told him, "I wish the United States would lead." Walesa then told Polish TV, quote, "The superpower has not been up to the job." When America assumes its rightful place as what President Ronald Reagan had dubbed that shining city on the hill, there was a moral compass in the world. There was some sunlight that exposed the difference between right and wrong and good and evil. However, under Obama's administration, there is no sunlight shining that spotlights evil, so all the cockroaches are now coming out of the woodwork at once. When Obama abdicates our role as moral leader of the world, there are plenty of actors on the world stage that are more than eager to just zoom in and fill the void. To name a few, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, Ayatollah Khamenei and Hassan Rouhani of Iran, Bashar Assad of Syria, Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State. This has made the world, since Obama has assumed office, a much, much more dangerous place. But nowhere is it more dangerous than for our tiny little democratic ally in the Middle East, the state of Israel. Last February, I was at a conference where the head of Israeli intelligence, Aviv Kochavi, said then that there are 170,000 missiles pointing at Israel in every direction. The situation has become even more dire with the Islamic State now gaining a foothold in Israel's northern border with Syria. And as you know, just last week, some of the UN peacekeeping forces were kidnapped by the Islamic State from the Golan Heights. In 2005, Israel went through the excruciating process of evacuating every single remnant of a Jewish presence from Gaza. Jewish millionaires, thinking that they would be magnanimous and give the new Palestinian state some sort of economic infrastructure, bought and donated to the Palestinians greenhouses. Jewish rabbis had said, we've got to donate our synagogues because they can be turned into mosques. After all, we all pray to the same God. Well, the very moment that the blue and white flag of the IDF was lowered and the last Jewish settler turned the key and closed the gate, those greenhouses and those synagogues and every other remnant of a Jewish presence was destroyed in what can only be called a hate-infested carnival of anarchy. And then Hamas came in through free and independent elections. After a brief power sharing moment with Fatah in 2007, the members of Hamas violently rejected the Fatah from the government. And as you remember, they were throwing members of Fatah out from hospital windows, and members of Fatah were saying, "Wait, I'm not Jews. You're treating us as though we were Jews." Since then, Israel has received at least 11,000 missiles from Gaza and has had to go in and fight 3 wars. Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 2009, Operation Defensive Shield in 2012, and Operation Protective Edge this summer. The Arab Spring, which began when a Tunisian fruit vendor, Mohamed Bouazi, immolated himself in protest of corruption and harassment in December of 2010, has spread throughout the Middle East like a tsunami and has made the Middle East the most unstable and precarious region in the world. While some of the old guard regimes were authoritarian and totalitarian, the region is now imploding from within. Many people erroneously had assumed that one election would make the people of the region into a Jeffersonian democracy. However, we have learned very painfully that one vote does not, and one election does not, a democracy make. The institutions of a democracy have to be in place, and that takes time. What we're talking about is a free and independent judiciary, a free and independent press, more than one election, the rights of religious minorities, the rights, as Natan Sharansky once said, to stand in the middle of the town square and criticize the government without fear of your very life. The United States, up until this summer perhaps, had just one and only one stable, dependable, democratic ally in the region, and the only nation in the world whose voting record in the United Nations is exactly identical to that of the United States, the State of Israel. As Irene said, Israel gives the United States the sort of dependable stability and eyes and ears in the region that no aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean could possibly replicate. And up until this past year, when President Obama and his Secretary of State, who like so many others cannot resist the siren call of being the one to secure his legacy by bringing peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Palestinians were actually doing quite well. They had a kind of de facto peace. This was peace from the bottom up. This, while every other nation in the world was imploding around them. They were an island of tranquility. Without a devastating blow of a war for the last few years, Israel's economy had been booming, despite the economic upheavals and the recession in most of the world. Then, on July 19, 2013, Secretary of State John Kerry announced that he reached an amazing breakthrough. The Israelis and the Palestinians would sit down together. But in order to do this, there were strict preconditions set by Mahmoud Abbas about negotiations around the negotiations. Israel was then cajoled, coaxed, and persuaded by President Obama at Mahmoud Abbas's suggestion to release 4 batches of prisoners who were guilty of some of the most heinous crimes imaginable from prison, like hacking to death on a beach in Tel Aviv an elderly Holocaust survivor, or the release of Haj Ahmed Omar Mustafa, who murdered an ex-American Marine while he was taking a hike, Stephen Frederick Rosenfeld. During the process of negotiations, when Israel wondered aloud if they could actually survive and live with the terms that were being imposed on them from the Palestinians and supported by President Obama, Secretary of State Kerry made statements such as, do you want another intifada? Is that what you're looking for? Ladies and gentlemen, I find this kind of talk from the American government highly irresponsible. It's almost like giving an American seal of approval for further violence. And then in April of 2014, Secretary of State Kerry said to a room full of influential leaders that unless Israel arrives at a two-state solution with the Palestinians, it risks becoming an apartheid state. I really resent that. I know people, I know South African blacks who lived through apartheid. This sort of comment gives also an American seal of approval to the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, which is spreading like hellfire through college campuses. And it also gives an American legitimacy to the kind of anti-Semitism that we're seeing throughout Europe. Of course, on the face of this, that kind of comment is patently absurd. Apartheid is the institutionalized and systematic oppression of one racial group by another. No concept could be more ludicrous than when describing the government of Israel, when there is an Arabless Israel, when there are Arab members of the Knesset or the parliament who constantly exercise their democratic right to criticize Israel from their podiums, and there is an Arab member, Salam Jabrub, of the Israeli Supreme Court. All of this led Israel's defense minister, Moshe Ya'alon, to remark on January 4th, all that can save us from John Kerry is for him to win a Nobel Prize and leave us alone. Unfortunately, that got Boogie Ya'alon, or Moshe Ya'alon, who's a friend of mine, into big trouble. And these negotiations broke down because Mahmoud Abbas had wanted the fourth prisoner release to include Israeli Arabs, which would create a homeland security nightmare for the Israeli citizens. However, as we all know, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. Diplomacy is a complicated business. Folks used to believe, let's just get the parties together and sit down. As long as they're talking, they could do no harm. However, that's not necessarily true. When a peace proposal, which involves many complex factors and a long history of religious overlays and emotions, is presented as a simple bifurcation of alternatives, either this package or war, we know that talking could be very, very dangerous business. At this point, President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry's interference has led to a bloody war this summer, which resulted in over 2,000 Palestinians that were killed and over 70 members of the IDF. And we all know why the numbers are so disproportionate. And I'd like to say a word also about proportionality. In military terms, proportionality doesn't mean you weigh how many of one side against how many on another. And there were 133,000 civilians that were killed by America in Iraq. It's absurd if you look at it. In military terms, proportionality means the least number of civilians killed in order to reach your military objective. And we all know by now that Hamas hides its bombs in schools and hospitals and playgrounds and communities, and they hide behind their civilians. So I'd like to submit that the kind of strong arming and bullying techniques that Secretary of State John Kerry uttered during the peace negotiations with Israel have empowered Hamas to first kidnap those 3 Israeli teenagers and then to step up its lobbing of rockets into Israeli territory. And when there is sunlight between the state of Israel and the United States, that is when all of Israel's enemies feel empowered to strike out. What Israel is facing on its borders today with Hamas and Fatah and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah is no different than what most of the world is now waking up to with their concerns about the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Boko Haram in the Arabian Peninsula, or Ansar al-Sharia in Libya. In this age of asymmetric warfare, we have got to realize that our enemies are not necessarily nation states, but radical ideologies that are easily transmitted as a speech in a mosque or a click on a computer mouse. And ideologies, especially those which come wrapped in the package of a religion, are much more difficult to defeat than standing armies of nations. What we are facing today is the hatred of the Jew of a Nazi, wrapped up with the religious zeal of a crusader, and combined with the willingness to die for your cause of a kamikaze pilot. Israel has learned great things from this past war, which, as we know, might be ongoing. And one of the things that they have painfully had to learn is that with this administration, they could depend on no one but themselves. Israel's not alone in this feeling. All of America's allies are finding themselves scratching their heads in bewilderment and wondering whether or not America and Obama will wake up from their long retreat from the challenges of the world and do this before it's too late. Thank you very much. I have to say we're really lucky tonight to have Lori Reagan. Lori is a brilliant writer and thinker, and she writes constantly for the American Thinker. And I met Lori through the Republican Jewish Coalition, and I'm really honored to have her serving on my board of directors, and she's also the president of the New York chapter of EMET. And we are trying to develop chapters all around the country because we are trying to cause an intellectual revolution. Our feeling with EMET is that the same old paradigm just is not cutting it anymore. And the foreign policy establishment in Washington has basically looked at everything through the lens of a two-state paradigm, a two-state solution, thinking that Israel's a little wrong and the Palestinians are a little wrong and the truth is somewhere in the middle. And Israel has been on the side of right. And you cannot, when there are people that are trying to obliterate your existence, the truth is not somewhere in the middle. This is a difference between right and wrong. We're trying really hard to create an international revolution within the foreign policy establishment, and we're trying to plant revolutionaries, chapters of intellectual revolutionaries around the country. We also think that for far too long, people have seen the Israeli Palestinian conflict as the linchpin, the key to the solution in the Middle East. And believe me, if Israel weren't to exist, that would not make Sunnis and Shiites sit down and sing Kumbaya and love one another. So I think, so we have, we're really, and we have been hearing the same old, tired, flawed premises to our foreign policy paradigm being articulated over and over and over again. So we're trying to change the thinking around in Washington and throughout the country. And I'm also really, really fortunate to have with me today Jennifer Deckel, who is our Director of Research and Communications for EMET. She's sitting on our left. Jennifer is a fabulous resource, knows a great deal about the problem from within our borders as well.
Just very briefly, I wanted to, well, first of all, as always, it is an honor to be on a podium with Sarah Stern. And I know that this is your first introduction to Sarah, but believe me, Sarah is a force to be reckoned with, and she is a godsend. She is a gift from God, and I don't say that, lightly. I say that with all seriousness, and I look forward to all of you, hopefully in the future, getting to know Sarah and EMET and all of the great work that she does. She, thank God, is fighting on our side, and not just for their survival of Israel, which we all, I think, recognize is really on the, on the where Israel goes, so will the rest of the Western world. So Sarah is also fighting for the survival of the Western world. And unfortunately, there are too many people that do not understand really just how close we are to entering into a very dark age. We all take for granted that the past several decades since World War II have been quiet, and there's a reason why. There was a Pax Americana that existed that has since been revoked under the Obama administration. Now, I understand that this is a Republican gathering of an organization of Republican women, and it's lovely to see a lot of men out there as well. A lot of people ask me, why is this a partisan issue? Why is the Republican Jewish Coalition called the Republican Jewish Coalition? And unfortunately, it is a partisan issue, not by choice, but by the fact that the Democratic Party has chosen to argue over whether Jerusalem can be mentioned in their charter, their platform. And when I was asked to speak at an organization of Jewish women, there were 5,000 from all over the country, and in my particular breakout session there were 200, I was screamed at that Romney, this was a month before the election, Romney was going to take away their daughters and granddaughters' rights to an abortion. Obama's a great friend of Israel. I wonder, I wish I could go back to now and ask each one of them what they think about that. So this is, unfortunately, a partisan issue, and I'm not sure how many of you are not Republicans, but I'm glad to have you all here, and I'm glad that to the extent there are people here that are not Republicans, that you are open-minded and that you have come out to get to know Sarah Stern and EMET, because it is a nonpartisan organization, but it is fighting for the survival of Israel in the Western world, which is unfortunately something that I believe only one party is doing right now. I want to just also say that having joined Sarah in this fight and having joined the board of EMET was one of the best decisions that I ever made. I've known Sarah for a long time. It is a pleasure to be among Sarah, her board members, the supporters of EMET, Irene, Debbie, and all the people that understand the issues that we're facing today. And everybody might not be on the same page about those issues, but we all can get together, we can discuss the issues, we can agree, we can disagree, but we're intellectually curious, and we care, and we're concerned enough to come out tonight, and we're concerned enough to put the time in. So my hope is that that all of you here tonight take the time to get to know a little bit more about EMET, take the time to get to know Sarah. You can reach out to me at any time. My information will be available, and I'd love to have you all in your chapter. Let's grow this, pass the word to everybody. We don't have to come out for an event like this with a speaker. We can meet for coffee one day. We can meet in the city. We can meet in Westchester. We can, to the extent that all of you know people in the New York metropolitan area, please share what your feelings were about tonight with your friends and family, and let's take this conversation a step further. And on that note, I would like to start the conversation with Sarah, and I thought, well, the best place to do that, I think, is to start with asking Sarah to tell, because some of you might not understand what Sarah and EMET do. They're based in Washington, D.C. Sarah is pounding the Hill in the Capitol, speaking to politicians, speaking to decision makers, policy makers, day after day after day, in an exhausting job with Jennifer. And yes,
Adam.
And Adam, right, Adam, who is not here. Right. And so I thought maybe, Sarah, you could tell us a little bit about your activities on the Hill. What are you doing? What have you done? And what successes have you achieved?
Well, in general, we educate. We're a 501c3, and we spend most of our time educating. We educate about what it is that radical Islam is, or what Islamism is. We educate very much about certain issues which sometimes lead to legislation. One of the things that we've been fighting since the Oslo Accords were signed on September 13th, 1993, is the whitewashing of Fatah. And people want Fatah to be referred to as the good cop They are the reasonable ones as opposed to Hamas. When throughout the war this summer, if you look at Palestinian Media Watch, Itamar Marcus's website, it's PMW or PalestinianMediaWatch.org, you see that Abba Mazen himself was inciting people to start an intifada in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, if you will. And that every single day there is another kind of horrible incident of either a television show for children where they're extolling the virtues of being a suicide bomber, or these little geography lessons for kids about their beautiful Palestine, from Haifa to Rosh HaNikra to Eilat, which is, pre-1967 Israel. So people don't really realize this, what's being taught. And one of the things that we've been working on recently, especially since this war, is UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency, which was established in 1949, a year after the High Commission of Refugees was established. Now, the High Commission of Refugees was established in order to resettle the refugees of World War II into their host nations. But the Arab League then rejected that idea because they wanted to keep their Palestinians living as refugees in squalor as a thorn on the side against the Israelis. And they used them, and they told people to run away from their homes in the War of Independence. And right now, we're very, very concerned, particularly since UNRWA has had schools that were used to conceal their rockets during Operation Protective Edge. And in one case, after this was found, a rocket was returned to Hamas because the head of UNRWA said, well, it has to be returned to its rightful owner. I mean, this is absurd. These are American taxpayers' dollars. America pays the largest share of UNRWA. So a couple of years ago, I was working very, very closely with Eliana Ross-Lahagnan on some legislation that we could select, which said we could select which UN agencies American taxpayers pay dues towards. But unfortunately, the UN is like godmother apple pie to many people, and it did not pass. But we want, again, to expose UNRWA and to take some of the funding away, the American taxpayers' dollars, away from this agency, which has been more of a part of the problem than part of the solution. One of the things that we've had successes on, there are two things that we've had successes on are a few things, but one of the things, the biggest success was passing the Kobe Mendel legislation. Kobe Mendel was a 13-year-old boy who unfortunately did the Huck Finn thing in 2001 and skipped school. Unfortunately, the punishment was not worth the crime. Kobe's body was found brutally mutilated. He'd been stoned to death inside a cave near his family's community of Tekoa, Israel. Now, I had known Sherry and Seth Mendel. They lived in my community of Silver Spring, Maryland, before they decided to go live in Israel. And I knew that I had to call them when they were sitting Shiva or going through the period of mourning, the Jewish period of mourning for Kobe. And I didn't know what to tell them. So I told them the truth, that I was working for a different organization and I had proposed some legislation about taking the entire issue of Americans that have been killed anywhere around the globe and taking it out of the portfolio of the State Department because, to be honest, the State Department's job is diplomacy, and to put it into the portfolio of the Justice Department because we felt that this was an issue of justice. And I did not want the equal pursuit of justice for all American citizens who've been killed by terrorists around the globe to be contaminated by political and diplomatic factors. So I was able to successfully pass this bill in 2005. But I had called up Sherry and Seth when they were sitting Shiva, and I told them that, and I could never forget Sherry's response when I said, "Would you like me to name the bill in memory of Kobe?" And she said, "Sarah, I could just see Kobe jumping up and down in heaven to have a law named after him." And I thought to myself, "Sweetheart, it's a long way before a bill becomes a law." But at that point, I knew I was not going to rest until it was passed. And in 2005, the bill was passed. It was actually signed into law by President Bush. And in May of 2005, the Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism was open in the Department of Justice. So I thought, yay, we've had it. We had a victory. It was a rather Pyrrhic victory because, unfortunately, I was naive to think that this office would be hermetically sealed to the Justice Department. They still get their orders apparently through the State Department, and they have never once in all the 9 years since they've been open actually pursued justice for American citizens that have been killed, especially by Palestinians. There has been one case of an American missionary that was killed in Indonesia, Jim Spires. His wife, Patsy Spires, now works in his Office of Justice for Victims of Overseas Terrorism, and that was the only time in all the 9 years that it's been open that they've actually pursued. And what they do, what I created, unbeknownst to me at the time, was actually a source of pain and frustration, further pain and frustration for the family members, because they go and they meet with them all around the United States, or if they happen to be living in Israel, and they say, "We are just this close to capturing the murderer of your son or daughter, but don't do anything. Don't seek further legal action. We're just on it." And when they ask specifics about the case, they say, "Oh, we can't tell you. That will compromise an ongoing investigation." So, that is a kind of victory, but it's not. I'm calling for hearings. I'm asking members of Congress in the appropriate committees of jurisdiction, which is the Judicial Oversight Committees, to have hearings on why now this office has been open for 9 years and we have not been able. There have been over 70 Americans that have been killed since the signing of the Oslo Accords by Palestinian terrorists, and not one of these murders have ever been brought to justice. So, on our shores. Now, there's a 1991 earlier statute called the Anti-Terrorism Act that says that any time an American has been killed anywhere around the globe, we have the right to apprehend that suspect and bring them to these shores to stand justice. Now, some of these people have been released in the prisoner releases that Israel had been forced to make, and we know their whereabouts. One of them is this woman, Hassan Ashrali, who actually is treated like a goddess. She went back to Jordan. She has her own television show. She gave tips about how the Boston Marathon bombers should behave to get away with it. I mean, it is just disgusting. We know where she lives. We share an extradition treaty with Jordan. If we wanted to go after her and apprehend her, we could. She killed 2 Americans, Malky Roth, who was a 15-year-old beautiful girl, and Judith Greenwald, who was a 31-year-old school teacher who was pregnant with a child. So you might say she killed 3 Americans. And she is on tape. We have the evidence. You can look her up on YouTube. She said, when I finished this mission and I dropped off the bomber, she planned the whole attack in the Sparrow Pizzeria bombing, and I walked back to get my bus back to East Jerusalem, and they were talking in the Zionist tongue on the radio, and the bus driver was translating it, and he said everybody was high-fiving and handing out candy because of all the Israeli Zionists that were killed. and we saw the Palestinian policemen high-fiving in the streets, and there was this festive atmosphere, and I was saying to myself, should I do this? Should I tell them I'm the one? No, I'm just going to be modest. I'm not going to take credit for it. I mean, I am so glad I'm married to a gastroenterologist, because it can really make you nauseous when you see enough of these things on tape. But we can apprehend this monster, and I would like to also submit, by our willfully blinding ourselves for things like that, believe me, the Islamic terrorists in the Islamic State, or ISIS, if you will, have taken note. And when we give a pass to the murder of our American citizens, we are showing weakness. All along, we should have been showing strength.
Hi, I want to thank all of you for coming here and for the work you do. Despite what she said, I know that you have reached across the aisle. Okay, that's all I want to say, because it's relevant to my two-part question. Number one, my understanding is the tunnel costs approximately $3 million, and 30 tunnels were built, basically about $90 to $100 million. Right. What is the status of the legislation that you have worked on to prohibit funding UNRWA, and more specifically in our district? What has been the position of our congressmen and our elected officials on this?
Okay, we're actually still gathering signatures, and we're still on the Hill for our UNRWA legislation. This is a hard time because the war had just ended when the August recess was about to begin. So everybody said we're going to speak this over with our bosses, but we will get back to you after they come back from recess. I have to say there have been very few profiles and courage from this area. There are people that sign certain pieces of legislation that are kind of superficial in terms of foreign aid to Israel, and they're easy. But when it comes to things like actually going against the Obama administration and crossing him, it's very, very difficult. Now, I have to say there are some Democrats that I've worked with that are very good. Eliot Engel is a fabulous Democrat who has really been honest. And he's very, very disappointed in Obama, and he's scared. I mean, Eliot Engel he's a great American, and he is a great Jew. And he's bewildered about his own party. Robert Menendez from New Jersey. Robert Menendez really took Obama to task on the sanctions legislation, but the Obama White House took him to task. And they read him the Riot Act. And it was the Menendez and Kirk legislation. It was bipartisan. So there have been some incredibly courageous Democrats, but they're few and far between, and it's so hard to go against this White House. You know, they need to get the support of the White House when they want to campaign. You know, and if they cross the party line, you know, they're taken into the woodshed. So, yeah.
I just want to add two brief thoughts. The first is that it's important to understand, I think, that one of the difficulties, and I'm not alleviating the guilt of the Obama administration, in the funding of UNRWA is that the Israeli government does not want to take on the responsibilities that are involved with maintaining the Gaza education, water, the support that's involved. And so they recognize the problems and the corruption, the massive corruption and fraud in UNRWA. At the same time, until recently, there's been no thoughts about who could replace UNRWA. Asaf Romarovsky and Alex Jaffe, both professors involved with Scholars for Peace in the Mideast, have written an article recently suggesting that perhaps the Palestinian Authority could now take that over. Is that the best solution? Of course not, but if anybody can come up with a better solution, that would be one thing. And then the other thing I want to mention is this does go to the problems with the Obama administration, is that you've got tunnels on the other side also. And Israel had an ally in Egypt that Obama threw under the bus to replace with the Muslim Brotherhood. Right now, we've got a good friend back in with the military government now in Egypt. But to the extent that you can control what goes into the Palestinian Authority to rebuild tunnels. It's very difficult.
You know, this administration has seen no problem with sending FBI agents into Benghazi after they kill U.S. citizens and burn the place down to the ground.
Right.
Here, you're presenting a case here where we have someone identified. We basically have their fingerprints all
Right.
over it. All right, why not send the FBI in?
Right. We have been trying, and I would love, that's why we want to get hearings. I mean, if you can talk to your Congressman Steve Israel to work with EMET that we need hearings, that we would like justice for the American citizens who've been killed by Palestinian terrorists, that would be amazing. But so far, he has not been very helpful.
But I think you also answered your own question. Why one versus the other? I mean, we're talking about American citizens killed in Israel. There's a value judgment, I think, that's made on again, we go back to the partisan issue on the Democrat side. I don't think that certain lives have the same value as others. And I think that Americans and Israelis killed in Israel, unfortunately, just don't have the same level of value from the perception of some that or the decision policy-making standpoint.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Yes.
And this is actually one thing about EMET that we really pride ourselves on, and that is we don't necessarily support everything that the Israeli government does. Actually, in 2005, we were out against the Gaza withdrawal. We are for cutting aid to the Palestinian Authority, even though Israel gives aid to the Palestinian Authority. We do not waver from our ideological stances. We have been trying to challenge the predominant two-state solution that is basically dominating foreign policy. We've brought in speakers such as Carolyn Glick just to present new ideas and ideas of how Israel can deal with the problems of the Palestinians without creating a two-state solution, without giving in to our enemies. And that's something that we really do pride ourselves and we really do think outside of the box. And we are not, subject, thankfully, to outside political pressures and can really work on the EMET and on the truth.
My question is really, should we all survive till January 20th, 2017? What is your sense of the rest of Congress? You're spending a lot of time on the Hill as far as, when there are votes taken, they're like massively, now they may have been safe votes as you alluded to, but they're massively in favor of Israel. So what is your sense that once this regime is out of power, that it's more likely that some of these initiatives would get through?
I think, I really predict in the elections in November, the Republicans, I'm almost positive will retake the Senate and maintain control. During the first Obama administration, when I saw what was going on in foreign policy, I said, Obama is going to go down as one of the worst presidents, if not the worst president, not because of Obamacare, but because of foreign policy. And then everybody was looking at Obamacare, and my husband said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Absolutely," because I just had this horrible feeling, when you give all these cues, like the hot mic moment, that our enemies were taking notes and listening, and they're taking advantage of this. So I hope and pray that we all survive. I personally hope, because I really want to see America restore its rightful place as moral leader of the world. I hope that we can capture the Senate, keep the House, and take back the White House.
Hi, thank you all so much. I'm very glad you brought up the point that the Israeli government is not interested in taking over the responsibility and the financing of what happens when this horrific organization, UNRWA, is relieved of its responsibilities. It's incredibly complicated, and that's always been the case. And I follow Palestine Media Watch. It's so shocking what Shrawi is saying, denying that Hamas used human shields, what Abbas is saying about the 14-story building that came down, comparing it to 9/11, which was the center for Hamas operations, and it goes on and on and on. So I didn't mean to make this statement, but the context is so confusing, and I read everything, and I follow everything. But obviously, there's something there in the PA that is something in terms of information and security that Israel needs to work with. And I mean, they are not stupid, and they're facing horrific challenges. So there's something there, as bad as it is, and it's very, very bad, what they say in Arabic and what they say in English and all of that. But I work on campus, I'm on a board of a Hillel, and it's so challenging, even having the conversation. So I'm in touch with a young man who, he's starting last year at Harvard now, and he served in the IDF. I mean, couldn't be more phenomenal kid. But he's much more left-wing than I am, but working on a unilateral withdrawal. And he says, Michael Oren, there are many, many on both sides who are seriously thinking about this and contracting the settlements so that you, but Israel at this point maybe should just draw the line and figure out where they want to withdraw to it. Would you please comment?
There, unfortunately, I think many Jews have had a very hard time living with the idea of being a winner after 1967. And I can't remember any time in history when people were attacked, had to fight back 2 defensive wars, and then had to get back the land. I'm sorry, but I actually happen to have a really close relationship with Michael Oren. I like Michael Oren very much, but if you ask Michael Oren today, after this past war, I don't think that he really believes the same thing.
I know because this young man he's worked with Raoult, he's worked
with,
you know.
Raoult, I know Raoult, I know them all well. I think, unfortunately, if you live in the Middle East, you have to understand the mentality of the people that you live around. And in the Middle East, when you're talking about negotiations and you're talking about a two-state solution and the truth being somewhere in the middle, they look at you like you are a jerk, you are a fool. And if you want to survive in the Middle East, you have to understand their mentality. You have to understand also that they're constantly talking about the peace of the brave. Do you know what the peace of the brave really means? The Habadiyah Accords that the Prophet Muhammad signed with the tribe of Quraysh in the 7th century only to vanquish them. And that when they want, so we really have to understand the mentality there. And right now, after there were so many missiles coming into Tel Aviv, if Israel were to withdraw from most of the unoccupied parts of the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, if you will, Ben Gurion Airport would only be a few kilometers away from Qalqilia and within easy missile range. So we have to be very careful. I mean, you can't. I remember in 1993, I had really good friends from the left. And they said to me, Sarah, it's only Gaza, Jericho first. If it doesn't work, we can always go back and reclaim it. And I looked at them and I said, but how much Jewish blood is that going to take? I mean, the secret for why I do this work so passionately and so hard is because I'm just a Jewish mother. And I feel like a mother tiger, and there are 6 million Jewish cubs there. And I have to protect them. And I feel like
Sarah says that from her heart, and you can see the way she speaks. I mean, her heart is invested in this.
I'm invested in this because we only have, after 2,000 years, we've only come back to reclaim the land. And there's like this is like a blink of the eye in history. And our people went through so much horrible, the exile, the repressions, the Dibby laws, the concentration camps, the gas chambers, we finally have our one little sliver of a Jewish state. Are we going to gamble with people that incite their children that one day they will have all of the land from Rosh HaNikra and Haifa down to Eilat, that that's what they teach their children every single day? No, I'm not willing to gamble that.
But what is there within the Palestinian Authority that the Israelis are depending on? And what's going to happen to that when, I'm playing somewhat devil's advocate, but that's what I really wanted you to.
I think there is a Jewish mentality where we're about to go into the high holidays, and every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we pray and we beat our chests and we think we have done something wrong. If only we tried harder. If only we gave back a little bit more. We repent for the collective sins of the whole people. And we always feel it's our responsibility. And so we feel we should fix it. We should take care of UNRWA. We should take care of the Palestinians. These people are teaching their children to kill my children. And to me, that is the litmus test. I do not want to give good strategic territory for them to launch more rockets and missiles into the homes of my daughter that lives in Modin between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and just take a gamble, a risk for peace. We've had enough risks and we've buried enough Jewish lives.
Okay, different questions, and that is, what does Israel have a department that would present a positive PR? Because all we get in the New York Times is
All right, I have to tell you, I have a good friend from the Israeli embassy, Lenny Ben David, who used to be the deputy chief of mission, and after he retired, he took on certain projects for PR. One of them is this beautiful charity called Save a Child's Heart Foundation, where Israeli doctors work and they do sensitive heart surgery on mostly Palestinian children, but children throughout the Arab and Muslim world. It's very sophisticated, and they're flown in from all over, and he submitted thousands and thousands of packets, of PR packets to different newspapers. Only one Christian newspaper took the story. I don't think it's so much that Israel isn't trying. I really think that there is a deep-seated anti-Semitism, and that's just emerging now, that people are beginning to understand. I mean, if you look at what happened in the last war, it was only an Indian journalist and a few foreign journalists that were able to record that Hamas was launching the rockets from communities, from neighborhoods, and from schools. And if there's a wonderful piece in Tablet magazine by someone named Mati Friedman, who talks about, Mati Friedman was a journalist, he is a journalist for AP, and he was an editor, and he knew any pro-Israel story was a story that their editors would not accept. So I can't blame Israel for this. I really do think that a lot of this is anti-Semitism, and we just have got to get the truth out ourselves.
And I think that I appreciate the question about what the Israeli government is doing, but we, as Jews in the diaspora, also have a responsibility to protect Israel, because that is our only place that we're safe. If you all have been paying attention to the protests across Europe, we're well aware, but there have been protests in New York City, in Seattle, in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, in San Diego, and on and on and on, that have been violent and ugly. And when I say violent, I'm talking about the language. I'm talking about what they're saying about back to the ovens, and Israel equals the Nazis, and on and on and on. And you all need to take to the streets also, because I have participated in pro-Israel rallies, and some of the turnout at some of them has not been so wonderful. And one of them was in front of CNN, and it was against the, against the media and the bias in the media. But how many of you and your friends and your family still get the New York Times subscription? Now, you recognize the bias in the New York Times. I gave up my subscription in 2003. but there was just a liberal, there was a liberal, lifelong Democratic rabbi that also, I believe the piece was a tablet also, who just, the title was Why I Gave Up My Subscription to the New York Times. Lifelong liberal Democrat Reform rabbi finally gave up his subscription to the New York Times. It's not too late.
New York Post.
Okay, go ahead, extra question.
Is it possible for EMET to consider the approach of providing or encouraging only goods and services, as was done with Saddam during the oil embargo for UNRWA? So they have no capital, no cash, just goods and services from purely a humanitarian basis. So Israel can say, you're getting your support.
You may need a promise.
Okay.
That's a great idea. The problem is it doesn't solve the problem of what they're teaching in these UNRWA schools, these curriculums. If you go into the territories, as I have, and you look at the schools and you see the map of Palestine hanging all over the walls, that, which is the familiar map that we recognize as Israel. And you see what they're teaching. Now, I've often said on Capitol Hill that, in terms of providing the Palestinian citizenship with just goods and services, that's fine. But in terms of what's going on in these UNRWA classrooms, if we're going to foot the bill to the extent that we have over the years to the Palestinian Authority and now to Hamas, unfortunately, under President Obama, we could at least try to control the curriculum. And they said, no, that's interfering in their domestic affairs. But we really, when we're talking about this culture of incitement for hatred, after World War II, there was a period of denazification. What they are teaching these children is no less than what they were teaching the Hitler Youth. And I think that we owe it to our children and our potential grandchildren to re-educate these people for peaceful coexistence.
Well,
That is something that
I was
would like
referring
to
to the
solve.
concrete
Next question,
for
we have to
tunnels.
move on.
Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Ann, how are you? Ann, terrific.
ISIS's last email to Foley's family read like something out of a horror movie. We will not stop until we quench our thirst for your blood. And your, I assume, means not even just Jews, it means Christians, it means any religion, not theirs, any race, color, creed, or otherwise. What, in your estimation, is their next step, not only in the Middle East, but right here on American soil?
Well, I know that they are planning something really horrible. And I am frightened. But not so frightened not to speak out, not to talk, and not to exercise our liberties. I think there are people that have been asleep in the wheel of history. 2001 was a wake-up call, but they put their hand back on the snooze button. I think with the execution of Jim Foley and Steve Satloff, we are seeing people waking up again. And I know that these people, it has like elements of the communist threat because they are an expansionist ideology. They want to establish a worldwide caliphate, but it's much, much more dangerous than the threat we faced in terms of communism. Let's face it, the communists didn't believe in God, they didn't believe in an afterlife, they didn't believe that they were going to die for Allah and meet 74 virgins. So in a sense, this is a much, much more difficult threat. And it's a threat that knows no borders, and it's coming into our... Yeah, and so I think it's a much more difficult threat than any threat that our nation has ever had before. Because with communism, these were limited to nation states, and they did not have the zeal of a religion, and they did not think that there was going to be an afterlife. So this is very, very difficult, and we have the wrong person in the White House. Right now, we need a Winston Churchill, and we have a Barack Obama.
Could you tell me how Europe, England, France, Scandinavia, I know that Norway will not accept any Israeli products. Could you tell me how each of these countries is in this particular time and place?
Well, it's really interesting, and I think this is an abject case study for America. If you look at what's going on in Europe, you know that the most popular name in a nursery in Europe for a boy is Muhammad, and for a girl is Fatima. And I think they're intimidated by them. They're thugs. They're really, these people are brutal thugs. Jennifer Deckel today just told me that 18 Muslim women were arrested today in France because they wanted to firebomb a synagogue. We know that they have had in France horrible events where people went to a synagogue to have a memorial service for these 3 Israeli boys that were kidnapped, and there was an anti-Israel demonstration, and they were locked in the synagogue. People were trying to break in, and they were fearing for their lives. We're hearing horrible reports about England, where people are going into places that sell Israeli products, and they're knocking the products off of the shelves. They're telling people they can't go into kosher butcher stores. They're standing by the door. It's so intimidating. It's really horrible. I have a friend from London, and she said that her parents said that they haven't seen anything like this since the Nazi period. In Sweden, a young woman was wearing a Jewish star, and she was beaten up and harassed so badly. Her face was distorted. I mean, this is horrible. And I think we have got to be careful. Obama has made it so easy for Muslims to get into this country. Meanwhile, he is making it so difficult for Israelis to get into this country. Do you know that he has taken away the number of bureaucrats in the Israeli embassy in Tel Aviv and the consulate in Jerusalem because he said there are budget cuts, so he won't be able to give them visas. And he also said that he doesn't like the way Israeli young people come here and they're selling products in the malls and they're overstaying their visas. Meanwhile, he said that you could come into this country if you just show, quote, a limited amount of support for terrorism. I defy him to please define for me what is a limited amount of support for terrorism. You provide the weapon, but you don't fire it? What does that mean? You know, you're a member of Hamas, but not on the Islamic State. But this is really, really, everything has become Kafkaesque, upside down and backwards. And it's scary. It's really scary.
And I'm going to simplify it a little bit. It's called anti-Semitism. And that's, the anti-Zionism is not different than anti-Semitism. And what you're seeing across Europe and in the protests in the United States are simple anti-Semitism. And it has not gone away. It's rearing its ugly head, and it's very dangerous.
And Lori wrote a fabulous article in the American Thinker about a protest that she unfortunately witnessed that was really brutal and ugly right here in New York City.
Lori and Sarah, how can we get involved? Specifically, what can we do?
Okay, most important thing is we need to develop chapters around the country. We need to become an alternative force. Okay, well, see, first of all, Lori, she's going to be, she is the president of our New York chapter. You know, Irene is an amazing dynamo and such a go-getter. If you want to start a chapter of EMET, that would be wonderful. We are your emissaries on Capitol Hill. We're in Washington on Capitol Hill every day. If you have suggestions for things like Linda Stolberg, a wonderful member of our board, just told us of this horrible confab that was going on in Michigan, the ISNA conference, and I tried really, really hard to prevent, unfortunately, Governor Rick Snyder from coming, who is a Republican, and he did, unfortunately, but I just wrote an article about it. So whatever you hear of happening around the country, let us know. If there are things happening here in New York, we can try to put out the fires. From Washington, we write a lot, we publish a lot. We have seminars on Capitol Hill every single month.
Do you need financial support for these things?
Oh, definitely.
And how can we do this?
Oh, anything helps. We
There
do
are
this.
flyers?
There are flyers. We have all sorts of brochures. We have flyers. We need it desperately. We could, yeah, you could go to www.emetonline.org. Jennifer's going to pass around brochures and pledge cards if people want to help, even if you just give $1, that's all you can afford. We appreciate everything. Our operating budget is so minuscule compared to that of the major Jewish organizations that keep on just validating the same old, same old. And, you know, if you believe in our, we're very honest with you. We tell you that, we tell the truth. You know, if you believe in our positions, and you might not want to support us. But what you see is what you get, and we tell you that. So, okay, thank you very much.